Is it possible that some of the billionaires in the United States could, as the billionaires in the South did in the 1850s, I mean, they weren't billionaires, but the oligarchs in the South did in the 1850s, could they start a second civil war? Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and please subscribe to our channel. In this article that I wrote that's up over at TruthDig, it was on Raw Story and Alternate for a while, but I think it's scrolled off, but it's still on TruthDig. Where I'm asking, could an oligarchy of the morbidly rich basically overthrow our democracy or create a second civil war, literally a second civil war, where people are shooting each other, as the Atlantic is hypothesizing? And, you know, I pointed out that to shift a democracy into an oligarchy requires three basic things: control of the media, control of the legislative branch, and control of the judiciary. And the oligarchs in this country have succeeded in all three of those. We know from the 2014 study that Gillens and Page from Princeton and Northwestern published that the desires of the bottom 90% of Americans are not being turned into legislation and haven't been since the 1980s. The Reagan Revolution was genuinely a revolution. It turned America, it began the process of turning America from a functioning democracy into a full-blown oligarchy. And now, in my opinion, we're in the process of moving from an oligarchy into a tyrannical oligarchy, an oligarchy that has a police state attached to it. And we'll see, as Bill Barr, I guess December 9th is the date that he said he's going to announce the outcome of the investigations into police agencies, looking into the FBI. Now, you know, police looking at themselves, that, you know, has a long and storied and positive tradition. You know, internal investigations, internal affairs divisions. You want the police to be looking over themselves. But the FBI already has that. The Department of Justice already has that. It's called the Inspector General. And the Inspector General's job is to do with the FBI and with the Department of Justice and with the other police agencies, the Secret Service and whatnot, that are overseen by the Department of Homeland Security. The Inspector General's job is to basically do the same thing that when you watch the cop shows on TV where they all hate internal affairs because internal affairs is looking for bad cops. They do the same thing. So we've already got that. This is coming from an appointed political official, Bill Barr. And so that, you know, that's a very, very dangerous thing. So how do we step back from this? Or where is this going to go? Where does it go next? In my opinion, if Trump is reelected, the beginning of the police state that you're seeing right now, with Bill Barr ordering investigations into people like James Comey, the former FBI director, people who investigated Trump, will expand. And anybody in government who has dared to defy Trump will be taken down. It's already happened within the Republican Party. Look at Justin Amash, the Republican from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who has, you know, had to leave his party. But it will start happening in a far more serious and consequential way. The Navy Secretary today resigning because he would not go along with Trump saying that a Navy SEAL who shot a teenage girl in the stomach and her terrified friends had to drag her off before he shot one of them or shot her again. That, you know, he's just fine. He's a good guy because he's on Fox News all the time. Don't you know? But the point that I make in this article is that we have been here before. That the Civil War was about oligarchs rising up and then creating a police state. In the South, there were a couple of thousand plantation owners who basically controlled the economy of the South. They were the South's oligarchs. I mean, we know the names of many of them from the 1700s. Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, right? These were oligarchs, Southern oligarchs. Well, by the 1850s, they had become massively richer. The South actually controlled more wealth when you consider the value of the human beings who had been enslaved by these Southern oligarchs. In addition to all the other wealth of the South actually controlled more wealth in the 1850s than did the North. Now, that flipped with the Industrial Revolution. By the 1880s, that had completely changed. But in the 1840s and 1850s, that was very much the case. And the North made their money selling the products of the South, principally cotton, or using the products of the South, making cotton into clothing in the mills up, through Massachusetts and New Hampshire, New York State. So the oligarchs in the South, in order to enforce their oligarchy, created a police state. They had these slave patrols that the Second Amendment provided for. And they, it was a terror state, terrorizing the individuals who'd been enslaved. Virtually all of them, of course, being African Americans. There were a few Native Americans and there were a few white people, but the vast majority, 99.9% African Americans, who had been kidnapped and brought here, or whose ancestors had been. And those oligarchs were looking at the North, and the North was getting richer and richer because of manufacturing. I mean, the Industrial Revolution is generally considered to have started in the 1860s, 1870s. But really, I mean, we had railroads going in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. We had, we were making steel. We were certainly mining coal. A lot of that was in the North. And so the Southern oligarchs were looking at the potential for the rise of oligarchs in the North. This was before Carnegie and Rockefeller and all that. Those were all in the 1880s, 1890s. So this was before the rise of the Northern oligarchs. The Southern oligarchs looked at the North and they said, pretty soon you're going to have Northern oligarchs and we're going to be in conflict with them. What the hell? Let's just split off our own country and continue to run the South as, not as a democracy, but as an oligarchy with a police state. And Abraham Lincoln had two choices. He could say, okay, see you guys later, or no, you can't leave. And he chose the latter, and that got us the Civil War. But that was the first time that oligarchs declared war on the United States. The second time that oligarchs really seriously tried to rise up was during the so-called Gilded Age, the 1880s, 1890s. And you go back and you look at the history of that time, and I wrote this book called Unequal Protection: How Corporations Became People and How We Can Fight Back. And the book really starts in 1886 with the Santa Clara County Supreme Court decision. But when I was researching that book, we went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and in the Morrison Remick Waite collection, he was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court at that time, we found many of the papers that were associated, because he was the Chief Justice, with other justices from the court. And while Waite himself was not corrupt, and in fact he ruled in the Santa Clara 1886 decision, the corporations are not people, even though John Chandler Bancroft Davis, the clerk of the court, wrote in the opinion, or in the the header to the opinion, the head note to the opinion, that Waite had said, we all agree corporations are people. He took it completely out of context. While Waite was not corrupt, Stephen J. Field was. Stephen J. Field was the member of the Supreme Court from California. He also, back in those days, members of the court also were circuit court judges, and so he was he did the Ninth Circuit, which was California at that time. And he was the one, in fact, who sent the 5 railroad tax cases up to the Supreme Court, all of them on using the device of corporate personhood, saying that corporations were persons. He was desperately trying to get this done. Well, it turns out he was doing this because one of the railroad oligarchs was bribing him. So we had the railroad oligarchs in the 1880s, and the steel oligarchs, and the coal oligarchs, and the oil oligarchs reaching out and bribing members of Congress, trying to seize control of the legislative branch, bribing members of the judiciary, the Supreme Court, trying to seize control of the Supreme Court. And of course, they already had, strong control of the electoral processes through gerrymandering and things like that. And we fought back. We fought back with the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. And then 10 years later, 11 years later, Teddy Roosevelt became president. And Teddy Roosevelt used that act to break up these big corporations and slow down the oligarchs, the rise of the oligarchs. And then William Howard Taft after him, the two progressive Republican presidents did this. And then came World War I. And then after World War I, the oligarchs said, okay, let's try it again. And they sponsored Warren Harding in the election of 1920 to become president under the platform of cut taxes at the top. The top tax rate was 91% at that time. Cut taxes and have less government in business and more business in government. In other words, privatize and deregulate. And Harding won. And for 9 years we had rule, actually for 12 years, we had rule by Republicans and oligarchs. We were running as an oligarchy during what was referred to as the Roaring '20s. And it was roaring for the top people at the top. I mean, 90 some odd percent of the stock was owned by the very, very rich. While wages at the bottom actually stagnated during the Roaring '20s. Average working people saw their wages were flat or went down, just like now. And then, of course, came the great crash in 1929, and that led to Franklin Roosevelt, who fought back the oligarchs and turned us back into a democracy. And we were a democracy, in my opinion, right up until 1981, when Ronald Reagan was elected with money from the oligarchs because of the 76 and 78 Supreme Court decisions, Buckley and First National Bank, that said that when oligarchs own politicians, keep in mind the 3 steps to starting an oligarchy, to flipping a democracy into an oligarchy, are seizing control of the media, seizing control, legalizing bribery so you can seize control of the legislature, and seizing control of the courts. And in those 2 decisions, the second one actually authored by Lewis Powell, the Supreme Court said if billionaires want to own the politicians, that's fine, that's legal. That's free speech. It's protected by the First Amendment. And that led to millions and millions of dollars being poured into the Republican Party. The Democratic Party was still largely funded by unions at the time, so they didn't need that money. All this money went into the GOP, and that brought the Reagan Revolution. And within a decade of Ronald Reagan being elected, we no longer were doing what the people wanted. We were no longer a functioning democracy. We were doing what the oligarchs wanted. We were doing tax cuts. We were doing deregulation. We were cutting back on environmental protections. We were cutting back on worker protections. We were making it harder to unionize. I mean, right across the board, everything you can think of. They started attacking the social safety net. They were taking apart the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and all those programs, attacking food stamps. Even Bill Clinton got in on the act because the oligarchs told him, you got to do this. Right after he was elected, saying he was going to govern like FDR, in just 2 weeks before he became president. I mean, it's a famous story about how Jamie Dimon and Alan Greenspan, and there was one other guy, sat him down and said, son, here's the facts of life. And he ended up, with the Telecommunications Act of '96, allowing the oligarchs to take over the media. He said, welfare, as we know, is ending it. In one of his State of the Union addresses, he said, the era of big government is over. And we've been basically in oligarchy ever since. Now, how do we reverse that? In my opinion, the way that we reverse that is we have to reverse these Supreme Court decisions that allowed the oligarchs to control our legislature. This is why no Republican will defy Trump, because they are owned by oligarchs who are benefiting from the Trump presidency. And we have to reverse that. Now, we've been talking about a constitutional amendment for a long time. There are other ways to do it as well. I've talked about those on this program in the past, but I just wanted to lay out the broad outline here, because I think that it is entirely possible that the oligarchs who now own the Republican Party would be willing for us to have a second civil war if it preserved their power, just like the oligarchs in the South pushed the first Civil War. What do you think?